Ja, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, liebe Gäste, ich spreche auf Deutsch und würde allen raten, die das nicht können, sich jetzt noch schnell ein Headset zu besorgen. Okay? Lama, ja. You understand German, that's good. Ja, dann noch mal mit neuem Anlauf. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, liebe Gäste. Ich möchte Sie ganz, ganz herzlich im Namen der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung und im Namen unserer Kooperationspartnerin Amica zu unserer Konferenz Kein Frühling für Frauen willkommen heißen. Für uns ist es was ganz Besonderes als Stiftung und was Einmaliges, dass fast 40 Frauen aus Ägypten, Libyen, Syrien, Palästina, den USA, England, dem Balkan und dem Nordkaukasus zu uns hier nach Berlin gekommen sind, um sich mit uns zu ihren Erfahrungen zum politischen Umbruch, aber vor allem zu den Erfahrungen, was es bedeutet, sich mit sexueller und sexualisierter Gewalt auseinandersetzen zu müssen, uns damit zu beschäftigen in den nächsten Tagen. Ich glaube, dass dieses Treffen mit 40 Frauen aus ganz verschiedenen Ländern, mit ganz verschiedenen Erfahrungshintergründen auch was Einmaliges ist, nicht nur für die Stiftung, sondern auch für diese Bundesrepublik. Ich glaube, es hat es noch nie gegeben, dass es gelungen ist, eine so tolle Gruppe von Gästen, Partnerinnen und Partnern hier nach Berlin zu holen. Von unserer Seite aus und von Amica aus ganz, ganz herzlich willkommen an unsere internationalen Gäste. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie hier sind. Und wir freuen uns umso mehr, weil Sie aus teilweise sehr schwierigen politischen Verhältnissen kommen, aus einer Umbruchssituation, die gewaltförmig verläuft, aus einem Bürgerkrieg, der grausame Folgen zeitigt und viele Flüchtlinge aus dem Land und im Land und in der Region wie in Syrien vertrieben hat. In den Transformationsländern der MENA-Region stehen viele drängende politische, ökonomische und strukturelle Reformen an. Und es sind vor allem auch die Kräfteverhältnisse und die Aushandlungsprozesse zwischen säkularen und islamistischen Kräften, die nicht nur die Gesellschaftspolitik und die Ökonomie der Region bestimmen werden, sondern ganz bestimmt mitprägend und zentral sein werden für die Geschlechterverhältnisse, für die Rechte von Frauen und natürlich auch darum, wie in diesen Gesellschaften überhaupt gesellschaftliche Debatte geführt wird. Wird sie demokratisch geführt? Wird sie inklusiv geführt? Kommen alle Ideen an einen Tisch, vor allem auch die Ideen von Frauen, die sehr viel beigetragen haben, im Umbruch sich zu artikulieren mit ihren Hoffnungen auf das, was der arabische Frühling sein wollte und hoffentlich auch irgendwann in Zukunft sein wird. Wir wollen mit Ihnen Ihre Erfahrungen im politischen Auf- und Umbruch teilen, an Ihren Analysen und Einschätzungen teilhaben. Ich hoffe auch, dass wir uns gemeinsam zu Strategien für einen demokratischen Wandel, für mehr Teilhabe von Frauen und Geschlechtergerechtigkeit austauschen können. Wir werden uns bei dieser Konferenz vor allem mit dem Thema sexualisierter Gewalt auseinandersetzen. Sie ist nicht auf die Region, mit der wir uns besonders beschäftigen, alleine beschränkt. Sexualisierte Gewalt gegen Frauen, Jungen, Mädchen, Männer sind ein weltweites Phänomen und sie sind vor allem ein Problem in Konfliktsituationen und in Umbruchssituationen. Auch wenn es heute mehr Aufmerksamkeit gegenüber geschlechtsspezifischer Gewalt, besonders sexualisierter Gewalt gibt, wird sie immer noch und viel zu häufig tabuisiert oder als Nebensache oder als Nebenprodukt von Konflikten eingestuft. Die Bandbreite der Gewalt ist groß und reicht von Nötigung, massiver Einschüchterung und Jungfrauentests bis hin zu Massenvergewaltigungen und sexueller Versklavung. Besonders der weibliche Körper gilt als symbolische Angriffsfläche in nationalistisch, ethnisch und religiös aufgeladenen Konflikten. Vergewaltigungen werden als kollektive Demütigungs- und Vertreibungsstrategie angeordnet. Die familiären und kulturellen Grundlagen der Gemeinschaften werden zerstört. Der weibliche Körper wird so als Waffe politisiert. Und sexualisierte Gewalt, das ist uns und mir wichtig und Amika wichtig, richtet sich nicht nur gegen Frauen und Mädchen, sondern auch gegen Jungen und Männer. Letzteres auch ein Tabu, das erst allmählich ins Bewusstsein rückt, dass eben auch Jungen und Männer Mittel im Krieg sind. Sexualisierte Gewalt als Waffe erleben wir gerade massiv im Bürgerkrieg Syriens, im politischen Umbruch Ägyptens und in Libyen. Mit allen 3 Ländern werden wir uns im Laufe dieser Tagung sehr intensiv beschäftigen, vor allem morgen Vormittag. Von ca. 4.000 Fällen von Vergewaltigungen und Schändungen in Syrien spricht das Syrian Network for Human Rights. Sie vermutet dabei trotz der erschreckenden Zahl eine hohe Dunkelziffer. Darüber hinaus gibt es Informationen, dass Regierungskräfte in Syrien und Milizen Frauen und Mädchen während Hausdurchsuchungen oder in Gefangenenlager sexuell missbrauchen. Auch die unabhängige Syrien-Untersuchungskommission der UN hält in ihrem Bericht vom August 2013 fest, dass sexuelle Gewalt im Syrien-Konflikt eine prominente Rolle spielt. Aus Libyen hören wir immer wieder, dass Frauen Opfer von Vergewaltigung und sexueller Gewalt sind. Aus Furcht vor Vergewaltigung durch Gaddafis Schergen entschieden sich Frauen für die Flucht. Und es wird auch zutreffen, und darüber gibt es wenig Informationen hier in der deutschen Presse oder in der Öffentlichkeit. Sie fliehen auch vor den Milizen, weil die Milizen in Libyen natürlich ebenfalls mit sexualisierter Gewalt agieren, Frauen verschleppen. Menschenhandel, wird berichtet, ist ein großes Problem in Libyen. Hinzu kommt die Stigmatisierung der Vergewaltigungsopfer. Sexualisierte Gewalt ist in Libyen ein Tabu, vielen anderen Ländern natürlich auch. Unterstützung wird in Libyen den Betroffenen kaum zuteil. Ende November 2011 kamen Frauen in Tripolis zu einer stummen Kundgebung zusammen. Sie forderten Unterstützung für die Opfer und Strafverfolgung der Täter. Getan hat sich seither nichts. Ein Gesetz in Libyen, das Betroffenen finanzielle Hilfe zuspricht, wird seit Monaten vom libyschen Parlament auf die lange Bank geschoben. Auch in Ägypten ist sexuelle Gewalt gegenüber Frauen ein permanentes Problem. Frauen sind auch leider während Demonstrationen nicht vor sexuellen Übergriffen und Vergewaltigungen gefeit. Human Rights Watch berichtet, dass im Zuge der Demonstrationen gegen Mursi Ende Juni in Kairo in 4 Tagen über 90 Frauen auf dem Tahrirplatz vergewaltigt oder sexuell belästigt wurden. Wir wollen auf dieser Tagung nicht nur das Thema geschlechtsspezifische und sexualisierte Gewalt in politischen Umbrüchen analysieren. Uns geht es darum, nach Antworten zu suchen, wie sie verhindert werden kann und vor allem, wie sie strafrechtlich verfolgt werden kann. Was gibt es für politische Ansätze, sexualisierte Gewalt zu verhindern, sie zu ahnden und Täter zur Rechenschaft zu ziehen? Gibt es so etwas wie Wahrheit und Recht für von sexualisierter Gewalt Betroffener? Gibt es so etwas wie Transitional Justice aus Geschlechterperspektive? Lange Zeit ist auf internationaler Ebene eine konsequente Geschlechterperspektive in der Friedens- und Sicherheitspolitik und in der Aufarbeitungs- und Versöhnungsphase ignoriert worden. Der unermüdlichen Lobbyarbeit engagierter Frauen weltweit ist es zu verdanken, dass wir zumindest auf UN-Ebene neue, auch völkerrechtsverbindliche Grundlagen haben, die die geschlechterdifferenzierte Sichtweise auf Konflikt und auf Postkonfliktsituationen schärft. Es gibt einen ganzen Reigen von UN-Resolutionen, auf die ich hier kurz eingehe, weil sie ein wichtiges rechtliches Rahmenwerk bilden, auch für das, was wir in den nächsten Tagen diskutieren werden. Die wichtigste, vor 13 Jahren ins Leben gerufene, ist die UN-Resolution 1325, die völkerrechtlich verbindlich regelt, dass Frauen auf allen Ebenen in Friedensprozessen, in der Sicherheitspolitik sowie bei der Konfliktbearbeitung vor Ort angemessen zu beteiligen sind. Diese Resolution stellt klar, dass die Verantwortung für den Frieden bei Männern und Frauen gleichermaßen liegt und Frauen gleiche Teilhabe brauchen, um ihre Vorstellungen einer friedlichen Zukunft artikulieren zu können. Ein sehr großer Schritt wurde 2008 mit der Resolution 1820 des UN-Sicherheitsrates getan. Sie erklärt, dass Vergewaltigung und andere Formen sexualisierter Gewalt, ich zitiere, ein Kriegsverbrechen oder ein Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit oder eine die Tatbestandsmerkmale des Völkermords erfüllende Handlung darstellen können. Zitat Ende. Mit dieser Resolution, wir sollten sie uns alle gut merken, stellte der UN-Sicherheitsrat ausdrücklich fest, dass sexuelle Gewalt gegen Zivilpersonen wiederum, Zitat, der Wiederherstellung des Weltfriedens und der internationalen Sicherheit, Zitat Ende, diametral entgegenstehen kann. Und es geht weiter mit dem Reigen der UN-Resolutionen. Macht deutlich, dass die von mir bereits zitierten Resolutionen 1325 und 1820 offensichtlich nicht ausreichen, um die Regierungen zum Handeln zu treiben. 2009 verabschiedete der UN-Sicherheitsrat 2 weitere Resolutionen, die Resolution 1888 und die Resolution 1889. Hier wird untermauert, dass sexualisierte Gewalttaten in Konflikten Menschenrechts- und Kriegsverbrechen und eine Gefahr für den internationalen Frieden und die Sicherheit sind, die rechtlich verfolgt und sanktioniert werden müssen. Der Krux, der Haken, das Problem: Bisher werden diese Resolutionen kaum oder gar nicht umgesetzt. Auch wir brauchten in der Bundesrepublik von Frauenorganisationen viele, viele Jahre der Lobbyarbeit, bis diese Regierung endlich in dieser vergangenen Legislaturperiode sich entschieden hat, einen Aktionsplan von Deutschland zu 1325 ins Leben zu rufen. Er ist uns nicht präzise genug, so viel sei gesagt, und es wird auch weiterhin politische Arbeit von Frauen brauchen, damit dieser Aktionsplan der Bundesregierung mit Leben erfüllt wird und tatsächlich den Frauen, die sich für Frieden, Sicherheit, für die Aufarbeitung von Gewaltverbrechen, gerade auch sexualisierte Gewalt, einsetzen. Und, das ist die jüngste Resolution der UN, im Juni 2013 haben die 15 Mitglieder des UN-Sicherheitsrats einstimmig für eine neue Resolution, die UN-Resolution 2106, gestimmt. und mit dieser Resolution ein klares Signal an alle Regierungen gesendet, dass der Kampf gegen sexualisierte Gewalt in Konflikten oberste Priorität haben muss, weil geschlechtsbasierte Gewalttaten nach wie vor unbestraft bleiben. Straflosigkeit ist das große Thema und wir werden uns im Rahmen dieser Tagung ganz sicherlich damit beschäftigen, wie können wir gemeinsam dazu beitragen, Straflosigkeit zumindest einzudämmen, aufzuheben und Täter zur Verantwortung ziehen. Das alles sind, wie ich finde, auf UN-Ebene in den letzten 13 Jahren bemerkenswerte Fortschritte. Sind diese völkerrechtsverbindlichen Vorgaben überhaupt ein Referenzrahmen, der in Ihrer Region, in Ihren Ländern ankommt? Und sind sie für uns alle ein Ansatzpunkt für gesellschaftliches, zivilgesellschaftliches Engagement? Schaffen wir es gemeinsam, auf die Durchsetzung zu pochen? Und was vor allem sind die Hindernisse, dass Regierungen, obwohl es Völkerrecht gibt, dieses Völkerrecht mit Füßen treten? Wo bleiben die Sanktionen des Westens? Wäre es nicht wichtig, um Frieden zu schaffen, keine Waffen mehr zu exportieren in Konfliktregionen? Das wäre zumindest auch von unserer Regierung hier in der Bundesrepublik ein erstes, aber sehr wirkungsvolles und deutliches Zeichen. Genauso wie es ein wirksames und politisch absolut notwendiges Zeichen wäre, dieses Landes Flüchtlinge aus der Konfliktregion, vor allem aus Syrien, aufzunehmen. Ich finde es ein Skandal, dass die Bundesrepublik Deutschland erst 5.000 und jetzt seit letzter Woche weitere 5.000 Flüchtlinge aus Syrien aufnehmen will. Das reicht nicht, gemessen an dem Elend, den die Flüchtlinge erleben müssen. Und ich finde, wir sollten auch hier als Tagung ein deutliches Signal setzen, dass Verantwortung heißt, auch humanitäre Verantwortung zu übernehmen für diejenigen, die in Konflikt leiden, von ihm betroffen sind und hier nichts anderes möchten, als aufgenommen zu werden, um leben zu können. Ich sagte es schon, es ist symptomatisch, dass die UN-Resolutionen nicht umgesetzt werden. Und es ist auch symptomatisch, trotz der Eindeutigkeit der Resolutionen, dass die Konflikterfahrungen und Gewalterfahrungen vor allem auf sexuell basierter Ebene von Männern und Frauen kaum in Konfliktlösungs- und Friedenskonsolidierungsprozesse einbezogen werden. Das Besondere an dieser Konferenz und an der Kooperation mit Amica ist, dass wir nicht nur über die arabischen Länder sprechen wollen, sondern auch gezielt von den Erkenntnissen und Erfahrungen profitieren werden, die auf dem Balkan und im Nordkaukasus mit dem Thema sexualisierte Gewalt gesammelt werden konnten. Das ist es, was wir mit dieser Konferenz vor allem auch wollen. Gegenseitiges Voneinander lernen, das soll im Vordergrund bei dieser Konferenz stehen. Zum Schluss meiner kleinen Einführung hier ein paar wenige Sätze zum Engagement der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in der MENA-Region. Wir arbeiten in Ramallah, in Tel Aviv, in Beirut und Tunis und bald auch in Rabat, Marokko. Und aus Beirut heraus arbeiten wir zu Syrien. Ich freue mich, dass unsere Büroleiterin Bente Scheller aus Beirut hier ist. Wir haben andere Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeiter aus der Region hier. Wir unterstützen von Beirut aus Partnerinnen und Partner in Syrien. Und wir unterstützen von Ramallah aus Partnerinnen und Partner in Jordanien. Tunis ist der Ort, an dem wir seit letztem Jahr sind und von dort aus ebenfalls mit ägyptischen Menschenrechtsorganisationen, Frauenorganisationen kooperieren. Ich möchte Ihnen sagen, dass für uns als Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung und auch für mich persönlich es ganz klares Ziel und Aufgabe der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung ist, Frauen bei ihrem Engagement für mehr Demokratie und Gerechtigkeit zu unterstützen. Geschlechterthemen sind bei uns kein Randthema, sie sind ein Kernbereich und auch, würde ich behaupten, ein Markenzeichen dieser Stiftung. Und es ist das Gunda-Werner-Institut für Feminismus und Geschlechterdemokratie, Abkürzung steht GWI, die Abkürzung ist das GWI in der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, arbeitet seit mehr als 10 Jahren unter anderem daran, die Geschlechterperspektive, feministische Perspektiven in die Außen-, Sicherheits-, Friedens- und Postkonfliktpolitik einzubringen. Wir haben jede Menge Publikationen dazu. Ich möchte Sie dazu einladen, sich dieser Publikationen zu bedienen. Wir mischen uns ein, wenn es darum geht, Frauen zu Recht zu verhelfen, die demokratische Teilhabe von Frauen zu ermöglichen. Und wir möchten, das ist, denke ich, ziemlich klar, vor allem auch die Vernetzung befördern und den Austausch, der nötig ist, das Voneinanderlernen zwischen den Regionen. Es ist zwar selbstverständlich, ich sage es dennoch deutlich und kräftig. Wir werden im Rahmen dieser Tagung über sexualisierte Gewalt an Frauen, Mädchen, Männern und Jungen reden. Für uns ist aber klar, Frauen sind nicht nur Opfer. Frauen sind Täterinnen, sind Aktivistinnen, sie sind aktiv involviert gewesen und Gestalterinnen am politischen Wandel in der MENA-Region. Wir möchten Frauen in diesem Transformationsprozess bestärken und unterstützen. Und ich hoffe, dass auch diese Tagung ein wichtiges Signal dafür ist, dass wir uns solidarisch mit denjenigen finden und sind, die für Gerechtigkeit einstehen und streiten. Ich möchte mich deshalb noch mal ganz, ganz herzlich bei Ihnen, unseren internationalen Gästen, bedanken für den weiten Weg, den Sie gekommen sind. Und ich hoffe sehr, dass die Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, Amica und hoffentlich auch dieses Land eine gute Gastgeberin ist. Ich möchte mich ganz, ganz herzlich bedanken bei Amica für die gute Zusammenarbeit, für die gute Kooperation. Und hier gilt ganz besonders mein Dank Heide Serra und Christina Hering, die die Konferenz mit vorbereitet haben. Vielen Dank für die gute Zusammenarbeit. Ganz besonderer Dank geht an das Nahost-Team der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, Antonie Nord und Sakina Abushi. Antonie, Sakina, ihr habt ganz, ganz tolle Arbeit gemacht, schon mal hier vorab mit viel Vorschusslorbeer. Es ist toll, was ihr hier zusammengebracht habt. Herzlichen Dank dafür und ich hoffe wirklich, dass wir alles dafür tun, dass diese Konferenz gelingt, dass sie das erreicht, was wir wollen, uns wechselseitig Stärke versichern, Solidarität versichern, voneinander lernen, einander zuhören. Ich wünsche uns und Ihnen alles Gute. Ich bin hier, so gut es geht, die ganze Zeit und freue mich, aus den Regionen so viel wie möglich mitzubekommen. Danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit und bis später. Dankeschön. Ich gebe jetzt weiter an Alexandra Senft. Alexandra Senft ist Journalistin. Sie wird moderieren, auch mehrere Male. Ich freue mich, weil Alexandra Senft die Region, um die es geht, die MENA-Region, den Nahen und Mittleren Osten, sehr gut kennt. Und ich freue mich auch, dass wir heute und hoffentlich auch in weiterer Zukunft gut zusammenarbeiten. Danke, Alexandra. Viel Glück.
Danke, Barbara Unmüßig, für die schöne Einführung. Bevor ich anfange, wollte ich sagen, dass hier ein Fotograf unterwegs ist, der auch das Publikum fotografiert. Wer nicht fotografiert werden möchte, möge das dem Fotografen bitte mitteilen, wenn er mit der Kamera auf sie hält. Ich bin, wie gesagt, Alexandra, wie schon gehört, Alexandra Senft. Ich bin Autorin und Publizistin mit dem Schwerpunkt Naher und Mittlerer Osten, als auch die Nachkriegszeit in Deutschland. Ich komme gerade von einer sehr bewegenden, anstrengenden Tagung in der KZ-Gedenkstätte Neuengamme in Hamburg, wo es um Täterschaft in der NS-Zeit gegangen ist, wo das Thema eben auch Opfer und Täter waren. Und man feststellen muss, dass fast 70 Jahre nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg viele der Verbrechen, die damals stattgefunden haben, auch die Vergewaltigung, auch die Gewalt gegen Frauen, bis heute nicht geahndet sind. Und ich finde es durchaus wichtig, das hier auch nochmal zu erwähnen, weil wir diese wirklich hochspannende Tagung ja auch in Deutschland haben und vor dem Hintergrund dieser Geschichte. Und ich möchte Ihnen jetzt keinen Pessimismus verbreiten hier, sondern ich denke, aus vergangenen Konflikten, die bis heute auch nicht geahndet sind, kann man natürlich auch sehr viel lernen. Hier auf dem Podium sollte mit Patricia Visser-Sellers und mir auch Frau Elvan Isikozlu sitzen. Leider war sie verhindert. Stattdessen konnten die Veranstalter Professor Nadje Al-Ali gewinnen. Diese ist leider heute in London auf dem Flughafen hängen geblieben. Es war jedoch möglich, sie gleich über Skype zuzuschalten, sodass wir hier dann auch gemeinsam diskutieren können. Es sind zwei höchst beeindruckende Frauen, die ich hier auf dem Podium bzw. im Hintergrund habe. Ihre Biografien sind so unglaublich voll, dass ich wirklich regelrecht Schwierigkeiten hatte, mir auszusuchen, was das Spannendste ist. Ich versuche es. Neben mir sitzt Patricia Visser-Sellers. Sie ist eine internationale Strafrechtlerin und Rechtsberaterin mit den Schwerpunkten internationale Gesetzgebung, Strafrecht, Menschenrechte und humanitäres Völkerrecht. Patricias Spezialitäten sind indes Genderfragen und Sexualdelikte. Und in diesem Zusammenhang hat sie vor allem auch am Internationalen Strafgerichtshof als Strafverfolgerin gearbeitet. Sie hat dort, ich muss fast sagen, bahnbrechende Verfolgungsstrategien auch entwickelt. Sie war als Rechtsberaterin und Anklägerin im Jugoslawien-Tribunal und beim Ruanda-Tribunal in den Jahren von 1994 bis 2007. Ebenso hat sie auch bei der Gender- und Frauenrechtsabteilung des UN-Hochkommissars für Menschenrechte gearbeitet und dem UN-Generalsekretär im Bereich Kinder in bewaffneten Konflikten zugearbeitet. Patricia berät heute Ermittlungsteams und Strafverteidiger auf verschiedenen Ebenen, also Regierungen, internationale Institutionen, NGOs, und vor allem immer dann, wenn es auch um Sexualverbrechen, Gewalt gegen Frauen geht. Sie ist unter anderem Gastdozentin am Kellogg College der Oxford University und hat auch unendlich viel publiziert. Sie hat auch sehr viele Preise für ihre Arbeit bekommen. 1999 hat die American Society of International Law ihr zum Beispiel den sehr renommierten Preis für herausragende internationale Frauen im Recht oder Frauenrechtlerin im doppelten Sinne herausgegeben. Ich könnte noch viel mehr über Patricia sagen, aber dann ist es abendfüllend. Ich weiß nicht, können wir Nadja schon sehen in London? Zugeschaltet ist gleich Nadja Sadek Al-Ali. Sie ist Professorin für Gender Studies an der renommierten School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Ihr Fokus ist Gendertheorie, vor allem im Nahen und Mittleren Osten, Frauenaktivismus und Frauenbewegungen in der Region, transnationale Migration sowie Krieg, Konflikt und Wiederaufbau. Sie hat in Bosnien, Ägypten, Irak und Jordanien gearbeitet, in den USA und heute weiterhin in England. Hallo Nadja.
Hallo.
Sie ist auch eine politische Aktivistin und hat die irakisch-britische Bewegung Act Together, Women's Action for Iraq, gegründet. Und sie gehört zu den Londoner Women in Black, dem weltweiten Network gegen Krieg und Gewalt. Im Zentrum ihrer zahlreichen Veröffentlichungen stehen sehr oft irakische Frauen. Ihr Buch Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East gilt als Klassiker und ihr zuletzt erschienenes Buch We Are Iraqis behandelt Ästhetik und Politik in Kriegszeiten, wobei es vor allem auch um die Kreativität als Form von Widerstand geht. Wir werden von den beiden jetzt zwei 20-minütige Input-Referate hören und dann zu einer Diskussion übergehen. Und Nadja, ich wollte dich bitten, dass du vielleicht den Anfang machst. Die Diskussion führen wir dann auf Englisch weiter, weil ich mit den Referentinnen dann auf Englisch spreche. Nadja, it's your turn. Hello.
Hello, thank you. And I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you. I tried my best, but it didn't work. Is it possible, can you see my presentation? Because I'm going to talk, I was hoping to show some images and some words in the background. Can you see that? Or is it a choice? Yes, here, okay.
Oh, okay.
So you won't see me for now, but but you'll see the presentation. So I just, before I started, I wanted to speak a little bit about the title. Clearly, when we talk about political transformation in the region, there's quite a range. I mean, people are now thinking about the more recent events, the various protest movements, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary transformations. And I think it's very important to stress that there's, of course, a range of different transformations going on. Some started more peacefully and some really overt armed conflict. And as someone who has worked both on Egypt and Iraq, when I think about political transformation, I'm thinking about quite different things. And in the Iraqi context, clearly, I also have to think about invasion and occupation as a starting point or a trigger point for transformation. And then I think the very excellent introduction, I've already made clear that when we speak about sexual violence, again, there's a huge range of different forms of violence, whether like right now in the Egyptian context, people are very much concerned about sexual harassment. But in the Iraqi context, for example, I'm also thinking about rape by US soldiers of Iraqi women, or right now forced prostitution and trafficking. And the very term Arab world, I think, also needs addressing and a bit of deconstructing, because clearly there's a huge range in terms of different histories, different political economies, different kinds of conflicts. So I understand, obviously, for the sake of a conference title, that one would speak about the Arab world, but I think it's always important to stress diversity also within each country based on class, and clearly there are lots of ethnic minorities that are not Arab in the region. So as I said, my own work empirically has been revolving very much about on Egypt. But I did my PhD on secularism in the context of the Egyptian women's movement. But more over the last 10 years, I've worked on Iraq, and I've tried to look at the impact of dictatorship, sanctions, invasion and occupation on women and gender relations in Iraq. And I've also in the past worked on Bosnia in the 90s. So let me start out by saying something about some of the main academic debates around sexual violence. I was asked to do that. And so when you look at the scholarship, there is a disproportionate amount of scholarship that looks at sexual violence in the context of various African conflicts and the sexual violence that is perpetrated by non-state actors. We also have some research, of course, in other empirical contexts, whether in South America, Chile, Colombia, or in South Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and then in Timor-Leste. But it's very clear when we look at the academic scholarship that the focus is on persecution rather than prevention. So, the question is more so, how can people be persecuted rather than how can we prevent sexual violence? And as was already stated, I think very importantly, it's also within the scholarship, there's a very strong recognition that, of course, sexual violence is used against men as well, and that while sexual violence is already a taboo issue when it comes to sexual violence against women, it is often even more a taboo issue when it comes to sexual violence against men. I myself, I'm a strong proponent of looking and analyzing and trying to understand sexual violence in its wider context, in terms of broader gender-based violence. Now, I then also try to understand, so what are some of the limitations, what are some of the gaps within the existing scholarship? And so I think historically there's very little about the relationship between colonial histories and sexual violence in conflict, particularly in sort of colonial and post-colonial struggles. There's also very limited scholarship, very little that looks at the relationship between the constructions of race, gender, and sexuality. The question whether the question of how often and why, towards which goal, does sexual violence in conflict actually occur? I mean, this, as an activist, in a way, I think this should be a key question. But actually, ironically, there's very limited scholarship and very limited comparative literature. So, looking at different contexts. And what are the methods used? What are the consequences? I know that a friend of mine, a colleague, many of you might be aware of her excellent work, Cynthia Coburn. She started to research to ask the question, in which conflicts and why, what are the settings in which sexual violence doesn't occur? Because I think that's also an important question to ask, not only why does it occur in conflict, but in which context, in which empirical context does, when we have conflict, when we have war, does sexual violence not occur? Now, I already mentioned that it's very important, I think, to look at sexual violence in terms of the broader continuum of gender-based violence. So when we look at sexual violence, I think it is problematic if we focus on it in terms of this whole question of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Of course, that is an important argument, but if we just look at sexual violence in this term, I think we miss the everydayness and non-political sexual violence and the continuum of what happens at a sort of acute war and conflict situation, and what happens when there's cessation of conflict prior to and post a war conflict situation. What happens at home, what happens within families, what happens at the workplace, on the street, and so on. And of course, I think the actual idea of violence, I think we also need to think about it, violence and conflict. Cynthia Enloe, of course, very famously told us many years ago that for women, for women, the cessation of armed conflict does not mean peace. And so what does peace actually mean for women? And what does violence mean for women? Violence is not just linked to overt conflict, but there is a continuum. So I think it is very important to look also, of course, at structural violence. And here I am a firm believer that we need to pay attention to specific political economies. I have in my work, both in the context of Egypt, Iraq, but I've also looked at what's happening in Libya, to lesser extent Tunisia, Palestine very much so. The whole discourse about women and gender in the Middle East, gender-based violence, I think one big problem is the culturalization of what is happening there. And I think it's really important to not refer to their culture and their religion. And of course, the old Orientalist trope is try to refer to Islam and some sort of ancient Islamic rules and regulations that explain what is happening. No, we have to look historically specific. What are the relevant political economies? What are the specific legislation? And we know that legislation might derive, like the personal status code might derive from Islamic law, but there are very different kinds of interpretations depending on the specific political context. Education is very important. The media is playing increasingly a very important role. And yes, of course, culture matters. But culture in a broader sense, in terms of also film, literature, theater, music, And yes, religion, but religion, when we speak about, of course, there are lots of non-Muslim religious minorities in the region, so it's very important not to conflate the region with Islam. And of course, within Islam, there are huge differences in terms of interpretations and practices. So we have to be really quite careful when we, speak about the impact of Islam and religion. And then tradition. I mean, as an anthropologist, my antennas always go up when people speak about tradition, because I know that if something is sort of presented to me as a tradition, it often is actually maybe selectively taking something from the past, but inserting something new into it and then presenting it to us as tradition. I think the most visible phenomenon example being what is now coined as traditional dress code of Muslim women in the region. There's nothing traditional about it. It's a very modern new phenomenon. So I think it is important to, when we try to understand what is happening with respect to sexual violence and gender-based violence more broadly, we have to look at what is happening to men and masculinities. And I don't mean that in a simplistic, oh, there's a crisis of masculinity kind of manner. Of course, masculinities and femininities are always in crisis. They're always contested. There's always some movement happening. But I do think that what we see happening now is a contestation of masculinity and femininity at the heart of political transformation. I very much agree with the introductory words that sexual violence and gender-based violence do not stand outside the main processes, nor do constructions of masculinities and femininities. They are very much at the heart of current transformation and contestations. And I think lots of factors, I mean, I myself, in the context of my work on Iraq, I found that humiliation is gendered. What happened to Iraqi men and masculinities when they saw the pictures of men being tortured by American female soldiers in Abu Ghraib prison, for example? That did something very, very substantial to a sense of masculinity. But I think in many countries in the region, we see that there has been a quite devastating impact of neoliberal economic policies. And my colleague, Nicola Pratt, worked on it in the context of Egypt, where she argued that, because of the pressures due to economic structural adjustment and neoliberal policies, including privatization, many men and women were forced into labor roles, women often working 2 jobs in order to survive. And one of the consequences was kind of a nostalgia for going back to some kind of a time when men could be real men and be the providers for the family, and women could be real women and look after the house and children. Sort of the idea that in a situation where people are struggling economically, trying to make ends meet, ends meet, of course, working does not mean liberation necessarily. And I very much agree with my colleague and friend Denise Candiotti, who used the term or coined the term masculinist restoration to try to explain some of the violent backlashes against women in the context of the protest movements and the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary developments we've seen in Egypt, particularly, where she argued, patriarchy as usual is not existence anymore. It doesn't feel secure. Women are very much out there. They have been for a long time as part of trade union movements, political movements, in all kinds of different professions. And so the backlash requires a higher level of coercion and specific targeting. Hence, the forced virginity testing, the targeted sexual harassment, rapes, and so on. So I think this idea of masculinist restoration, I think, is a very powerful conceptual tool to try to explain some of what we see happening in the region. Now, as I already indicated, I think that now looking specifically at sexual harassment, which in the context of Egypt, there has been lots of attention in terms of mobilization, in terms of politicians, in terms of media. And while, clearly it is very important, my personal view is that it is problematic to focus on sexual harassment and sexual violence during protests without looking at sexual harassment and violence in a broader term, and also how it is embedded in broader gender-based violence. Clearly, the reason why there has been a focus, because it's clear that there is a systematic, targeted harassment, and there's a debate whether it's at the hand of the military or the brotherhood or the police or some thugs. But I think what is important, I would suggest, is to also look what's happening at the workplace, what is happening, in villages, what's happening outside of these protest contexts. And so there is a historical context linked to it, and there's also a broader occurrence. And I think we also really need to look at the wider normalization of violence as a context, challenging the public-private dichotomy that is often, we often sort of reproducing when we talk about sexual harassment. And I think really, to my mind, much of what we've seen recently in the region really challenges these old religious versus secular dichotomies. I mean, myself, I've been working quite extensively on secularism and secular political spaces, and I'm a strong believer in secular political spaces. But I think some of the way this masculinist restoration, the way sexual violence and more wider gender-based violence has occurred, we cannot attach it to either secular or religious constituencies, but it actually cuts across. But really importantly, and I think that's really gives me hope, is that the mobilization and the space to speak, the mobilization against, and the political space to speak out, to mobilize against sexual harassment is unprecedented. And I think this is really amazing. Yes, you have lots of men who are involved in harassing women, in there have been verbal, physical rapes and so on, but never before have there so many, especially young men, who are devoting all their energies and time to actually challenge harassment, sexual harassment. So I think that's really very, very important development, and that gives me lots of source for hope, actually. Again, I think that when we try to understand sexual harassment, we do need to look at structural inequalities which are linked to the specific political economy, linked to the history of neoliberal economics in Egypt, particularly. Now, I then like to conclude my talk by speaking a little bit about what I see as a very useful way of approaching sexual violence and gender-based violence more broadly in the region, but I think also elsewhere, which is I very much think that a transnational feminist approach is very productive. And when I say transnational feminist approach, I don't mean just transnational in terms of crossing over borders and being sort of not linked to a specific nation state, but I mean in terms of transnational feminist politics that recognizes the significance of intersectionality. And actually, are we in the right? I can't see. Is this already on a transnational feminist approach, the slide? Is this a transnational feminist approach? Yes. Yeah, okay, sorry. And so when I say intersectionality, I mean the recognition that when we look at gender, we have to look at gender as it overlaps, as it intersects with issues related to class, ethnicity, and I would translate intersectionality also differently in terms of different systems, hierarchies of power and inequality. So if I'm interested in, I couldn't, as a women's rights activist, trying to address women's rights in the Iraqi context, I couldn't do that without also addressing sectarianism, without addressing imperialism. So patriarchy as a sort of structure of inequality based on gender intersects with other structural inequalities. And here again, I would say that it's very important. We cannot sort of just make sort of a blanket statement. We actually have to do our homework and try to understand in a specific given historical and empirical context, what are the significant intersecting factors that account for these structural systematic inequalities. For me, as I mentioned before, I'm very much against this culturalization of gender issues. I think that's very problematic. It's their culture, it's their religion, and it's it has never changed. We really need to go beyond that. We need to look at the specific political economies, patriarchies. For me, authoritarianism is key. What I see happening right now is actually a struggle between authoritarianism and different forces that are challenging authoritarianism. And here, authoritarianism is again something that cuts across both secular and Islamic constituencies, because you have secular constituencies, whether they are the military or political parties, that can be very authoritarian, and obviously you can also have Islamic and Islamist constituencies that can be authoritarian. So I think we really need to move beyond this secular versus Islamic dichotomy. Militarism is key, I think, and also neoliberalism and imperialism, as I certainly learned in the Iraqi context. So I just, then I know that my time is up, I'd like to just sort of end on a note that while I understand that given the recent developments in the region, that there is an interest now and a focus on countries such as obviously Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and of course Syria. That is very clear why there would be a focus on Syria as well. But not only because I am of half Iraqi origin and have been working on Iraq, but I do would like to make the point that it is very sad that Iraq has dropped off everyone's agendas. It's not a country that by any means is peaceful. If anything, right now the situation is worse than it was during the height of the sectarian violence in 2007, 2008. It's terrible. It's particularly terrible for women, as forced prostitution, trafficking, kidnapping, rape, etc. are rife, and I should say have all been institutionalized in the name of liberating the country and democratizing a country. And I think Iraq is an example per se where the international community fails, and I particularly blame the US and the UK and having turned a blind eye and having been complicit. But also now, the last few years, the Iraqi government itself, which anything related to women is at the very bottom of the agenda. And I worry that we see similar developments in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadja, with your call to move beyond the dichotomies, which I think is a very interesting and important point. I would like now to ask Patricia to present her paper to us, which will more highlight the legal framework of what we are talking about during this conference. Please.
Can you hear me? Right. I would like to thank the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Have I pronounced that? Thank you. Thank you. And Amica, and my sister presenters, be you men or women, for the next day and a half. and very much the audience for coming out today and to listening to this beginning debate. And I'm happy to meet my keynote speaker presenter via Skype. I'm going to, now that I've heard her presentation, realize that we end up basically back on the same terrain, having taken very different roads. What my job is today, my task, responsibility, or privilege, is to try and put some of the discussion that we're going to have in the next day and a half, in particularly sexual violence, during conflict and post-conflict, and remember, pre-conflict, in some type of international law context. And I must say that the title of this convention's, it's intriguing. No spring. I mean, are we still in the thaw of winter? I would say we're caught in a rainstorm, a thunderstorm. And I think it's muddied the fertile terrain that politically could have been much more promising. And that once again, women have to take their buckets and their shovels and spend more money to get seeds to plant democracy. What I would like to do is, in essence, propose that our international law framework concentrate on two crimes against humanity. The beauty of crimes against humanity is that they can have a nexus to an armed conflict, but they need not have a nexus to an armed conflict, meaning they apply at all times, even in times that we refer to as peace. And the two crimes that I'm looking at are one that's a misnomer. It's a phrase I detest. It's called forced marriage. It's an illegal phrase because in international criminal law, there is no crime of forced marriage. It's more properly called slavery, at times slave trading or enslavement. The other crime that I'm going to speak about is persecution, but very unlike Nadje, I'm not talking about persecution in as people are being persecuted by taking them through court. What I'm going to speak about, what is the crime of persecution? When is someone being persecuted as a survivor or a victim? It's another type of crime against humanity. Yes, I'll be talking about utilizing the judicial order, be it national or international, as a transitional mechanism. But then lastly, I'm going to encourage you to reflect and to strenuously attempt to activate, in very practical terms, the provisions of CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because CEDAW has awakened within the past 60 days. It has promulgated General Comments number 30, which finally, after over 30 years of CEDAW, is specifically addressing women, girls, boys, and men in situations of armed conflict. For a while, it seemed as if that treaty was inapplicable, but General Comment 30 now shows how the provisions have to be taken into account and apply during periods of armed conflict and periods as well as periods of non-armed conflict. But first, what I'd like to do is take you on a tiny historical trip of sexual violence under international humanitarian law and international criminal law. And this is not a fairy tale, but I insist upon it, in essence, to disabuse you of any notion that what we're discussing here today is just politically correct, or we're finally appeasing those feminists so now they can start to shut up, okay? Look, we invented a couple crimes for you. Can you just be pleased and go back home? Let's run back about 2,000 years and look at the laws of armed conflict. And they come from all over the world. The Code of Manu from India in the Middle East. We have the Bushido codes coming out of Japan. We have early canonical codes coming out of Rome via the Catholic Church. What those codes have in common, and it's a striking commonality, is that the laws of war were set up to govern what soldiers could and couldn't do with each other. Can you use a boulder? Can you use a stick? Can you use a spear? Can you kill someone when they're down? And at the same time, the laws were set up, and if you read them, of what you could not do with the presumed innocent, meaning the non-fighting population, the civilian population. And the ideal was very practical. The soldiers are supposed to fight here, but the societies are supposed to continue. Scholars are supposed to continue to write. Religious persons are supposed to continue their activities. Farmers are to continue to farm and to reap and to harvest. Family life, even if it's under a system that's pre-feudal, is supposed to go on. The protection of the civilian population, the presumed innocent, is a collective protection. But it's a necessary protection because war was so not only preeminent, but constant. It was quite rare when a nation, a city-state, an ethnic group, or a tribe wasn't contemplating some war. And as many of you who are historians know, that these wars lasted 10 or 15 years. 5 years to march to the place, 3 years to fight the war, and about 8 years to come home. So because war was perennial, there had to be rules about not touching that society that was waiting. But nothing that was really gracious. There were two reasons that you weren't supposed to protect that society. Whoever won the war was supposed to get an intact society, a society that functioned. That's why you're fighting. You weren't fighting for ruins. And the second reason is that was part of the propaganda that sent many men to war, because you're protecting the home front. It will be there. So there were very practical humanitarian law rules, such as you were not supposed to burn down the fields. You were not supposed to cut down flowering trees. You were to leave scholars alone. And you were not supposed to touch women and children. And fishermen and farmers and all of the above were not supposed to be molested in their person. Those are code words, early code words for sexual violence destroys the civilian population and communities. That was a practical reason. It was not related to our today individual human rights. And these laws have been in effect in some way, although they haven't been enforced in many ways. So we could go right up, let's stop around the 13th or 12th century, where we have some of the early trials that were set up by the Roman state under canonical laws. We could go up to the 13th and 14th century when there was interminable fighting for Constantinople between Islamic Muslim communities and Christian communities. Well, the Islamic law of armed conflict that comes to us via the Quran and the Sunnas held that there must be a distinction between combatants and civilians. Civilians are non-combatants. And they extended particular special protection to the elderly, the sick, the wounded, and women. Well, the difference in the 13th and the 14th century, when the raiding occurred in Constantinople with the Franks coming down from Europe and the different Arab populations from the Middle East, is that the Ottoman Empire obeyed and enforced those laws. When the nuns were raped in Constantinople, they were raped by the Europeans. And the Islamists not only did not rape, they protected and took the wounded and the raped and the dead of the Christians so as not to violate their law. Yes, I emphasize that point because I do not want to get into discussions on our Western humanitarian law versus theirs. Humanitarian law has been formulated taking parts of different international war codes. And the warrior codes devolved from wherever there was war. I do have to admit that we haven't taken the Native American warrior codes as seriously as we should. And some of those are absolutely fascinating. But to bring us up maybe around the 1800s now, I want to say that the laws of armed conflict took into consideration not only sexual violence, they took into consideration slavery. you couldn't re-enslave someone who was liberated during a war. When we get to the beginning of the 19th century, the Hague Conventions, particularly the Hague Fourth Convention, all we have is a consolidation of humanitarian law and parts that have been taken from codes around the world, including the becoming of the Geneva Conventions, the codes from 1898 and 1864 for Geneva, which in Solferino basically codified what had been done in Constantinople, irrespective of the side of the injured. You're to care for the wounded and the sick. And those not taking part in the war are to be spared in their person. Okay, I'm going to go up to 1929. I stopped there because a very important thing happened in international humanitarian law. It was among the first times that very lucidly, in 1929, at the convention in Geneva, the German delegate proposed a very interesting provision. It said that female prisoners of war should be given all the consideration due their sex, which was code word for you're not supposed to rape the female prisoners of war. Didn't mean you could rape the men, you couldn't rape them either, but specifically you couldn't rape the female prisoners of war. Why? Because the female participation in World War I from Germany's side had reached heights that female participation in war had not before. Well, you say, why? Practically, because the opening of more nursing schools. There are more women on the battlefield or in the hospital as nurses who were captured as prisoners of war. During World War II, what is referred to as World War II in Europe or the Asian Pacific War in Asia, we have the Nuremberg trial and judgment and the Tokyo trial and judgment. The basis of their law, the legal basis of those tribunals, date from the 1906 Hague Convention, which just recognizes, as part of the customs and laws of war, so matter of fact, that if you read the Hague Convention, you don't even have to write it down, that you're not supposed to rape civilians during war. What was added new was that you had to have respect for family honor during occupation. It meant that the occupied inhabitants could not be raped also. Well, why have that rule? Now that you've won, can't you just do what you want? The practicality behind that thought was that sexual violence hampers and destroys pacification of occupied people. It's not their individual human right. And usually during occupation, you have fewer militia and military in those occupied zones. You don't have your masses of troops. And when you start to rape, you incur the inhabitants to start to snipe and to kill the few troops that you have. It's a practical rule. It serves the same effect. So in the Nuremberg judgment, there's been a lot of discussion. Where's the ruling on rape? One has to look at the evidence that was submitted and the legal basis to see that the legal safeguards were employed. And when one comes down to the evidence, we can go back into the transcripts and the testimonies. But if you would just look at the visual evidence of Nuremberg, you can see that forced nudity was rampant and replete throughout. Under the Tokyo judgment, which very few people want to read, I think it's better than Nuremberg. It's much thicker. Chapter 8 is devoted to war atrocities. You cannot turn 3 pages without hearing vivid descriptions of the sexual violence, whether it be rape, whether it be vivisection, whether it be males forced to copulate with their daughters, whether it be genital mutilations that occurred in the Asia-Pacific region, including the rape of nurses who were prisoners of war and the invocation of the 1929 Geneva Convention. So in 1949, when the new Geneva Conventions are drawn up, the 4 conventions, one addresses the wounded and the sick, the other the shipwrecked, the third prisoners of war, and finally, under humanitarian law, the 4th addresses civilians for the first time. But what it does is really codify what has been the humanitarian law for civilians for 2,000 years almost. civilians are to be respected, humane treatment. There's supposed to be no adverse distinction according to health, according to age, according to sex. So are you hearing the echoes of these worldwide codes that just come down into Geneva? Even though among the first times they mention words like rape, enforced prostitution, or indecent assault of any kind, which is now the broader term that we use to sweep up all forms of sexual violence. In 1977, we have the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, where it become even clearer. We talk about the special protection for children, including no indecent assault. And we apply the laws of armed conflict, not just to international armed conflict, war between two states, but to non-international armed conflict, which is a different way of saying civil war. But lo and behold, if you would look at the Islamic war codes, they make no distinction. War is war. You are protected in international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. In that sense, they stood hundreds and hundreds of years ahead of a consolidation of the laws of war for civil war, what we're talking about today. After the additional protocols came out and were put on the table and nations discussed them a bit, we basically forgot. It was almost 50 years from Nuremberg or Tokyo until Yugoslavia descends into war and Rwanda burst into genocide. The United Nations decided to set up 2 tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, in which both I served. So what law did they turn around and get? Well, the only law that's there. The Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, crimes against humanity that comes out during World War II, and the Genocide Convention. And this is a legal framework that continues until today. Now, how do we understand that from a gendered basis, from a sexual violence basis? Let me briefly just state, if one wants to consolidate, what did we get from Yugoslav Rwanda Tribunal? Of course, we understand that rape is a war crime, but it always has been. That's the secret. It would ruin my popularity, okay? But this has been going on for thousands of years. We also understand that sexual violence can become a component of genocide. But you know what? It always was. When you look at the Genocide Convention, and it talks about reproduction, measures to prevent births, or when it talks about causing serious bodily mental harm to members of the group, they're referring to sexual experiments, sexual experimentation, or sexualized experimentation. So this prohibition of sexual violence not only has always been present, it is continually evolving. The Yugoslav and the Rwanda Tribunal also added, I think, some flesh onto crimes against humanity by including rape, which basically had been from Control Council number 10, along with torture, but now just applying new facts to it. So rape as a crime against humanity, enslavement as crimes against humanity, torture, sexualized torture, have become normalized or maybe recognized as being more normal. And that is the demarche that right now I'd like to propose in terms of our lack of an Arab Spring or the prolonged winter. The Special Court for Sierra Leone, a court that was internationally mixed, had to deal legally with very difficult issues that were not raised at Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and particularly in terms of sexual violence. Those cases mainly dealt with child soldiers, or how one says politically correctly, children associated with armed groups. I'm going to say child soldiers for shorthand. Some of the cases included evidence of sexual violence, and some did not. The girls whom sexual violence was committed against, because they didn't look closely enough at the evidence and see that the boys were just as much /perpetrator victims, there became a debate due to the manner in which the prosecutor put the case forward as to, were those girls sexually enslaved when they were forced to be married to some of the persons mainly the men, or the adult men, in these groups. And it brings up the whole discussion of forced marriage, the misnomer, during periods of armed conflict. Is that sexual slavery? Is that enslavement? Well, because of that debate in which you will read the pages of that judgment, you can see that the judges are arguing with each other, disagreeing with each other, and basically coming to a standoff because of the facts. And the facts are, when those girls were sexually forced to be with these men, was that a part of slavery or only sexual slavery? And by the way, what did they really do? I mean, were they really enslaved? And what if they decided to stay? And what if they decided, you know, I'm more protected under him, survival sex, than letting myself be raped by everyone? And at the same time, in the Cambodia tribunal, there was evidence of, I hate the term, forced marriage, but their detainees were forced to marry each other and copulate for 3 days in the hopes that they would produce a child that then politically could be raised by the Khmer Rouge. So what are the real facts of forced marriage? When you have 2 detainees, or when you have 1 perpetrator and 1 detainee? And is that marriage? Because, you know, marriage is something we can all do. And isn't that kind of like arranged marriage? Or isn't that, you know, kind of like, you know, you're copulating if they stay together? Well, what international criminal law is saying today is, let's not confuse slavery or sexual slavery with any practice that might go on outside of a context of crimes against humanity or war. No matter how analogous it is, that's not what we're speaking about. What we're talking about, and this starts from the Kunarad's trial, commonly known as Foch in Yugoslavia, through Sierra Leone, not quite hitting the mark at Cambodia. What we are talking about is exercising the powers of ownership over someone via their sexuality. And that's what differentiates these types of either sexual slavery, enslavement, or forced marriage. Now, why am I bringing up this point at this conference? For this reason. In the 1980s in Iran, there's been evidence of political prisoners who were women, who were, in quotes, married or raped and then executed. And lately there was evidence coming out of Syria about females being detained and being married. Some were executed, or some were married for short periods of time and passed among men. My point is that we have to look at the facts and we have to understand the situation and look and see, are these women being held and powers of ownership exercised over them? And aren't some of the boy soldiers, weren't their powers of ownership exercised over them? I want to conclude with saying there are 2 ways in which we can make this inquiry. And this is the most egregious form, I think, of the sexual violence, and understand the entire breadth of all sexual violence, is with the CEDAW General Comment 30. It tells us for the first time, you have to apply international humanitarian law, international criminal law, in a non-discriminatory manner for gender-based violence. Not to apply it means not to, in essence, apply CEDAW, not to be beholden to your binding obligations of CEDAW. So how does that run back around to international criminal law? And here, I join my co-presenter with the term persecution. The definition for persecution under international criminal law, as a matter of fact, is quite simple. It's just the denial of fundamental human rights as an attack against the civilian population that's widespread or systematic. When we deny females their human rights systematically or widespreadly, that's another way of saying we're persecuting those females. And so today, when we transform our societies, whether from the most egregious or to the everyday denial of fundamental human rights, I think we have to look at a framework of persecution. Human rights join together now with international criminal law, international humanitarian law. I would hope that spring would come. I would hope that peace means no persecution, not just no armed conflict, but the presence of my full human rights and those of everyone else in the world. Thank you.
Are we going to see Nadje for the discussion now? Can we have a picture of her and some contact? That would be very nice. Thank you, Patricia, for taking us through a legal framework of centuries, so to say, where you quite rightly say we're dealing not with sexual violence, but basically war crimes. I wonder how many more centuries it will take until women's rights are really achieved, or sexual violence against women, men, and children will have an end. I'm observing that more and more in actual conflicts, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people are more and more reverting back to saying we have to refer back to international law. International law must help us break through this conflict somehow. One of the cases lately that really got a lot of media coverage was the rape in New Delhi last year. An Indian woman actually got a name worldwide, and the case of her rape was exposed very much, and it was brought to court. However, I wonder, maybe Nadje could relate to that. What does this mean in terms of reaching actually communities? Where does the law actually reach the communities that are perpetrating these crimes against the other? Nadje, could you maybe also from your experience in Iraq say something about that, please?
Well, I mean, I think as a feminist, I think I have a very ambiguous relationship to international law, I think, as probably many in the room have. I mean, I very much agree with Patricia that CEDAW is an important tool, and I was myself at the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung a few years ago when there was an event around 1325. Having said that, I mean, it's very difficult in a context, I'm thinking here particularly in the Middle East, where systematically UN resolutions and international law has been violated or has not been followed. I mean, thinking particularly Israel-Palestine, it's very difficult if you're a Palestinian women's rights activist to use international law in a situation where most, UN resolutions are just being ignored. And in the Iraqi context, you have a situation where it was the UN that for 13 years, from 1990 to 2003, was actually responsible for coordinating the most comprehensive sanction system ever imposed on a country that led to a terrible humanitarian crisis in Iraq. So it's very difficult now for Iraqi women's rights activists to use international law, to refer to UN resolutions, as UN is actually seen as part of the problem. Having said this, I was very happy to have been involved about 6 months ago. I was part of an initiative to write Iraq's ever first CEDAW shadow report. Iraq did sign up to CEDAW in the 80s under Saddam Hussein, but it's, of course, we know that the problem with law, and we need good laws, and it's important to have them, but we know also that there is often a very big gap, especially in situations where you have authoritarian dictatorships or lawlessness, where there is often a big gap between the existing law and the implementation of law, and there's, of course, lots of scope for interpreting the law. But I think, in terms of your reference to international law, our problem in the region is that there is a credibility problem, because international law is not being used systematically. And I be very frank, I mean, I really agreed with lots of what Patricia says, but I do have a problem. I think there is a swing of positionality in terms of, you know, who is speaking about what? I mean, I find it problematic that, you know, someone based in the US focuses on forced marriage as, you know, the issue to focus on when we speak about political transformation in the Arab world. I find that very difficult, actually. I mean, shall I explain why I find it difficult?
I think I get it.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not based in the U.S. I understand your point of view. And I'm bringing it up because it is a cutting issue in international criminal law, and I think it's one of the most egregious issues, not so much for the Middle East. So I'm trying to contextualize the Middle East within an international criminal scope, okay? I think also international criminal law, or international humanitarian law, as I've said, its main difficulty is the same difficulty that national law has. It's called enforcement, particularly as it relates to women and children. What is your rape conviction rate in Germany? You know, what is it in Brussels? What is it in Philadelphia? How much has it changed during 10 years? And the lack of feminist perspective, whether it be in international criminal law or human rights law, I agree with. The resolutions, I completely agree with you. I mean, the resolutions, there's always this debate. We're talking about Security Council 1325 or the 1860. I mean, I drew up the draft plans for the 1882 Children in Armed Conflict. And is that soft law, is that hard law? Security Council is not, it's not a legislature, and it's not a judicial body. And so, to the extent that enforcement is a huge issue, is to the extent that we have to work, and I think in particularly as feminists, to make the law responsive to us and to make it enforced. In terms of forced marriage, Alexandra kind of warned me when I came in. She says, oh, I was reading over your notes. You're going to talk about forced marriage here? Do you understand? We kind of are sensitive about that. So I'm being schooled in it, but what I want to say is I think when one, and I'm very much into looking at wartime female slavery, that I think that we can't avoid talking about forced marriage. And myself as a descendant of a slave, as a female descendant of a slave, where it's never understood how sexuality and slavery and ownership are joined, I think it's an issue that has legitimacy, and one doesn't need personal legitimacy to bring it up. I think it's legitimate. So very willing to engage in the discussion.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, you refer to an example in Iran in the 1980s, and certainly in the region there is, I'm not saying there's no forced marriage, but forced marriage, I mean, if we are speaking about political transformation, I would have thought that we're talking about issues that are more directly linked to political transformation. And I personally don't see that connection, but that's fine. I think that there is a problem in sort of taking out, you know, specific incidents. I mean, clearly, you know, it's very widespread in Yemen, but it predated political transformation. And I mean, I don't think that in contemporary Iran, actually forced marriage is a big issue. And I don't think it's a big issue actually in Egypt. There are many other issues. And of course, forced marriage is problematic. But I just worry about focusing on something that is not really, I mean, I think, you know, there are lots of people anyway in the audience who are from the region, and I'm sure tomorrow there will be sort of more discussions. I guess I'm reacting as well because, I mean, although myself, I am actually sick and tired of having to constantly challenge Islamophobia, and I'm certainly don't ever want to fall into the trap of being apologetic for discriminatory practices. But, you know, the thing is, when we speak about women and gender issues in the connection to the Middle East, we don't speak about them in a vacuum. I mean, there is a whole discourse around it, and especially in the post-September 11th world, there is a kind of civilizing mission, and, you know, women and gender are very much used as a marker of difference and civilization. So that's why where my sensitivity comes from. But at the same time, you know, I personally actually was upset with the way, for instance, when Mona Al-Tahawi published her very famous article, why do they hate us all? And so many of my friends and colleagues, particularly in the States, just slashed into her and criticized her. And I did actually come out and say, we have to look at the issues. But I think we need to look at the issues in its sort of complexity. And it's, I guess as an anthropologist, what I'm saying is we need to look at the specific context and the specific, realities, and not sort of, I think, make blanket statements about one phenomena or the other, because there is a range. And, I don't think, what's happening in Syria is the same what's happening in Egypt or what's happening in Libya and Tunisia. There are some parallels, clearly, and we need to make some generalizations. But I think too often there are these sort of blanket statements. That's, yeah.
Very briefly, so that everyone else can join in too. I think you misunderstood me. I'm not speaking about forced marriages as the daily phenomenon. I'm talking about it in specific situations, whether it be Sierra Leone, Cambodia, or Iran from the past, and reports in Syria, in a very narrow scope of detained people or children who are being held for years and years. People are breeding. I'm referring to that, and how do we look at that as maybe an egregious part of fundamental violations of human rights that be criminalized?
Right. Okay.
Well, I told Patricia about the discourse about forced marriages here in Germany, which was very much on the agenda for quite some time, and how tricky it actually is, because although there was something exposed that is not acceptable and that needs to be tackled, the way it was done here in Germany, at least, was so crude that it was politically instrumentalized to basically say Islam is responsible for this, and therefore Muslims are violence is inherent in the Muslim. Yes, I'm putting it a bit bluntly here now. Yes, but this is the way the discourse has gone. So I think it's going to be a challenge also for this conference to really figure out the right way of tackling these problems in societies, be it inside or outside. Yes. However, I'd like to open to the audience now, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions to Patricia and Nadja, and maybe you want to also add to something they said or whatever. Please speak up.
Hello. Thank you very much for being here. I respect your work, both of you, very much. My name is Lauren Wolf. I'll be speaking tomorrow about documenting sexualized violence in Syria. And Patricia, particularly for you, I'm wondering, having been through the ICTY, ICTR, all of the challenges and truly changing the way the world looks at rape as a weapon of war, while we're busy documenting it in Syria, I'm trying to envision a road ahead of potential prosecution, and I'm up against the wall trying to figure that out. I'm wondering what your ideas are.
I think you're right, because I think that there's some political powers, just in general, that make the case of prosecuting crimes that have come out of the Syrian armed conflict. I'm not even going to go into the post-conflict situation, the armed conflict, as to whether that will be transferred to the ICC. They have investigators, or will it be a separate ad hoc tribunal, or will it be national trials? Will that coincide with truth and reconciliation? But I think that you probably understand that one of the hardest things to do is to investigate while an armed conflict is still going on. And to speak to refugee populations, they're at various stages of, I wouldn't even call it recovery, I would call it just of feeling various stages of safe and unsafe at the same time. And so that makes it very difficult to get consistent and viable evidence. Well, I think that, first of all, you respect everybody for where they are in their, life story. And those who will speak now will speak, and those who won't. That's to be respected. But I think that the collection of information that might lead to evidence, I think the setting up of parameters, there was just an initiative in Washington where I do agree this initiative by mainly males and setting up what could be a statute for Sierra Leone had almost no female input. Two of the women involved kind of distanced themselves. There was no feminist perspective at all given to this. So I would say that we appear to be quite away from that as an international community.
Ja. Ich wollte etwas über Iran dann Ihnen erzählen, da ich selbst aus dem Iran komme. Das stimmt, in den 80er Jahren hat man junge Frauen in Gefängnissen, also bevor man sie dann hingerichtet hat, dann also es geheiratet und dann hingerichtet, wenn es sich dann um Jungfrauen dann handelte, weil man meinte, also Jungfrauen dann kommen also im Paradies, deswegen wollte man sie nicht als Jungfrauen dann hinrichten, hat man sie geheiratet, vergewaltigt und dann hingerichtet. Der Unterschied zu jetzt ist es, dass Frauen weiter vergewaltigt werden, nicht Frauen, auch Männer. Das ist noch dazu gekommen. Danke.
I just want to say, yes, I agree with you. I mean, I was on the Iran Tribunal, and when the evidence came out, there was a question, was this almost a manner of torturing in this very narrow factual incidence of someone who was about to be executed? But I do want to bring up one point, and that is that the three examples I gave, if you've noticed, Sierra Leone is what? Christian animus. Cambodia is what? Buddhist, right? So it goes back to your point of that it's related to politics of the situation.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talks. One question that came to my mind while both of you were speaking is, what is the significance of sexualized violence in your legal framework that you represented, or in the scholarly work that is being carried out? What is the significance of the sexualized component of violence? Isn't violence in general, already an important question that should be tackled? What is significant about using sexuality, which, obviously rape is not about sex, it's about power. It doesn't actually have anything to do with what we consider, the beauty of sexuality. So what is the significance to you in your work dealing with this sexualized part of violence? Thank you.
Shall I say something?
Yeah, Nadja, why don't you start, and then Patricia will refer to.
Okay. Well, I think that as many feminist scholars have pointed out, and I think it was already mentioned earlier, that women's bodies, women's sexuality are very much used to demarcate boundaries between us versus them, and whether it's in the context of nationalism or ethnic sectarian conflicts, when there is sort of an issue of constructions, conflicts between communities, women, as I think Nira Yuval Davis is probably the most famous scholar who has taught us that, women who are sort of seen to be the biological reproducers of a nation, of a community, are also the symbolic markers of a community. And that's why the control of women's reproduction, the women's sexuality, women's dress codes and mobility is so much at the core of nationalist, sectarian, communal, religious strife and conflict. And I think that that's one important element. The other one, I think, has to do with certain hegemonic masculinities and also I think competition between men and a kind of an emasculation that is going on, what I described in the Iraqi context as a kind of gendered humiliation, although I should say that, I mean, in the Iraqi context, interestingly enough, there hasn't yet been a sort of systematic rape. There has been sexualized violence in terms of, harassment and in terms of forced prostitution and trafficking. But I think that we need to, aside from this one strand that looks more at sort of nationalism and sectarianism, the other strand, I think, has a lot to do with contesting masculinities, a kind of emasculation, a kind of competition between men who are trying to assert a certain hegemonic, way, and especially in the context of a militarized society.
I'll say briefly, sexualized violence or sexual acts have, historically, and no one has done the history of sexual colonialism. No one has really done understands within the context of North and South American enslavement that males were sexually enslaved too. I mean, they didn't own their semen, like women didn't own their breast milk. They were sent out to breed to increase the financial property of the owner. So this sexualized violence has a life, okay? And as no one would question us talking about, psychological torture or fake executions, there's somewhere where we shouldn't have to justify the discussion of sexualized violence because we know it's so apt. I mean, it works so well. And that's among the reasons I think it's so often inflicted.
So, I think the gentleman sitting there has been trying to speak up for a long time. Maybe you share between each other, you decide who goes first.
I also had a question. Hi, I wanted to give or propose. What would it take in order to develop or build a legal body that could somehow enforce internationally these laws against, sexual violence and crimes against humanity and so forth and so on? Sort of like a UN, you understand? Like something that can work in unison with all countries, politically, as well as socially, as well as religiously, or whatever it takes. What would it take in order to do something like that? In order to create a body of government that can govern and enforce these.
On the one hand, I would say, I don't know. I don't know. But on the other hand, it takes people understanding from the ground up.
For sure.
That we're part of the international community.
Yes.
And we will not take this anymore. That you are violating my fundamental rights. You are persecuting me every day.
Yes.
But right now, sovereignty holds the power.
Yeah.
And there is no international police force. Just think about that. We have an international court, no international police force.
Yeah.
How does that work? Or how is that why that?
Well, I mean, I would imagine that the reason why all of these things are happening in such a way is that there's no enforcement. There's no one to regulate it. There's no one to say, hey, look, you're stepping out of line. We need to put you back in line. There's no one to do that. And so, hence, we have these problems. But if we establish something, or if we could find some way to establish something that's collective, that's international, that's a governing body that can say, hey, you've crossed this line, and now you have to answer for it. So that's my proposal. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on this? Of course, that in an ideal world, yes, of course, but in an ideal world, that would also be linked to this body that would enforce human rights more broadly, that would enforce the abiding of law more generally, that would enforce more equal access to resources. I think that's what I meant earlier with intersectionality and the kind of, when we look at sexual violence, when you look at gender-based violence, women's rights, we do also have to look at these other intersecting factors moving away. I mean, I'm certainly not, I don't want to go back into, if we solve that issue, then women's rights will be solved automatically. I mean, we know that history has taught us that no, nothing is going to happen automatically. And if anything, always women's rights drop off the agenda of any other political struggle. But, you know, I find it difficult to speak about sexual violence in the Middle East without also speaking about other forms of structural violence, you know, whether it links to occupations, whether it links to, you know, economic exploitation, whether it links to sectarianism, and I think authoritarianism, whether it is national authoritarianism or you were speaking about policing. I mean, there is, I think, many countries in the Middle East have been subject to a kind of world police that kind of has gone very wrong. And these are, when we talk about this, I think we need to name this. You know, we cannot just, I think, focus on this as if there was no political, as if this was a political vacuum.
I think I'll allow, if it's okay, 3 more questions. It's the gentleman there, the lady there, and the lady there, because we're already over time, I think, and we will have enough time to discuss tomorrow. So please keep your questions relatively short, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Fred Abrahams from Human Rights Watch, and I have a question about Libya and the role of the ICC, particularly for you, Professor Sellers, but Professor Al-Ali, feel free to weigh in. And what was, I think, noteworthy about Libya was the rapidity or the very quick reaction of the ICC. If I'm not mistaken, within 1 month, there were indictments, or at least requests for indictments from the chief prosecutor. And at that time, this is the former chief prosecutor, of course, made very strong statements, in particular about sexual violence and the use of rape. And I was hoping you could reflect a little bit on that. I mean, given my job as a researcher in the field who's grappling with methodologies and how to get the facts, from our side, quite frankly, we were a little bit surprised about whether the prosecutor was able to collect that enough information, enough evidence to make such forceful claims at that time. And I don't know, you know, this is still in process, and there's a big, fierce debate with the Libyan authorities about who will have custody now of the indictees, and this is obviously ongoing. Maybe we'll see how it plays out in court, if it ever gets to the ICC, which I doubt, actually, but even in a Libyan domestic court. So I was hoping, you know, you could reflect on that and whether the statements at the time were helpful or hurtful, and whether they'll be able to be substantiated. Thank you.
Let me just preface that with saying I'm here in my individual capacity, and I wasn't special advisor, as you well know, Fred, when this occurred. And in terms of internal evidence, we're not allowed to speak on it. I mean, that violates not only sometimes safeguards for potential witnesses, but other structures. And in terms of Libya and sexual violence, I think that you know, even as a researcher, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and other persons in the region, that there's been not only what you claim is difficulty getting to the evidence, there's been a bit of an approach that seems to want to use a lot of gizmos and gadgets, and now we can, you know, take a picture when you see this going on. And I've spoke publicly about it before. I think sometimes we're taking what's a masculine approach of counting numbers in terms of the sexual violence, as opposed to seeing how it just could relate to the upheaval of society. And I've been in situations when, you know, you've seen the films that I've seen, and we're looking at males who've been detained, and Human Rights Watch or others, no one's asking, A, where are the women? And no one's asking the men who are detained about sexual violence. So I can give you any hints in that nature.
So 2 last questions. Maybe you could pose them together, and so that we can answer them in a package, so we can close after that. So it's you, and then it's you afterwards, please.
Okay. Also ich habe 2 Fragen. Und zwar geht es darum, Sie sind in Jugoslawien Tribunal gewesen. Also ich habe vergessen, mich vorzustellen. Mein Name ist Jasmina Pripic, ich bin von Anwältinnen ohne Grenzen. Wir haben uns sogar vor 10 Jahren vor Hager Tribunal getroffen, als ich mit einer Delegation aus Kosovo war, weil ich 3 Jahre lang für die Organisation Medica Mondiale in Kosovo gearbeitet habe. Aber ich habe 2 Fragen bzw. 2 Probleme, die Sie durch Ihre Arbeit jetzt sehr gut kennen. Die erste ist der Schutz von Zeuginnen. Wir haben feststellen können, dass die Bosnierinnen, also viele Bosnierinnen sind bereit gewesen, als Zeuginnen vor Hager Tribunal auszusagen. Auf der anderen Seite gab es kaum Kosovarinnen, die aussagen wollten. Was der Unterschied war, dass Bosnierinnen sind nicht anders als andere Frauen der Welt, aber etwas, was wirklich selten in der Geschichte geschah oder überhaupt nicht, dass in Bosnien Frauen, die vergewaltigt worden sind, angehalten worden sind, bis sie in so hohen Schwangerschaft gewesen sind, dass die Kinder auf die Welt kommen mussten. Deswegen haben diese Frauen gesprochen oder als Zeuginnen ausgesagt, weil sie einfach nicht verbergen konnten. Die Kinder sind da gewesen. Auf der anderen Seite haben Kosovarinnen kaum gesprochen, weil es kulturell bedingt, insbesondere in Kosovo, schwierig war, was eine Zeugin zum Punkt gebracht hatte, die ganze Welt soll wissen, dass ich vergewaltigt worden ist, nicht mein Ort. Also das, was wir wissen über diese Zeuginnen, ist ein Problem in Den Haag gewesen, weil diese Zeuginnen nicht genug geschützt worden sind. Sogar gab es Fälle, dass bosnische Zeuginnen zusammen mit den Gruppen, die aus Bosnien kamen, mit Anwälten, mit Anklägern in einem Flugzeug saßen und es wurde bekannt, dass sie ausgesagt haben. Das ist etwas, was eigentlich nicht geschehen darf, weil wir sowieso Schwierigkeiten haben, Frauen zu finden, die bereit sind, auszusagen. Und ganz kurz, die andere Frage ist, dass UN-Soldaten, diejenigen, die Frauen schützen sollten, auch als Täter gewesen sind. Darüber spricht man kaum. Danke.
Nehmen wir noch die zweite Frage, the second question there, and then you can both answer. The lady over there.
I am a Syrian journalist. My name is Rula, and my question is more to Nadja. I agree with you, and obviously it is there is weakness in the UN resolution. It simply be ignored in the Middle East, and we see in Syria it doesn't help or protect any women. The question is, there is any alternative way, if there is any real way for women to not be used as a weapon in the conflict areas?
Patricia, would you like to answer first, and then Nadja, you have the final word, so to say.
Well, I completely agree with you in terms of witness protection. Logistics, that should have never, ever happened. And that's the complexity, and one could speak hours talking about the actual practicality of witness protection from the first encounter till afterwards. In terms of Kosovo, I can't comment on that, but there were people who came forward, and for many reasons, you might know, you might not know. Medica has done a wonderful job both in Bosnia and Kosovo. Some of the issues that are raised with Kosovo was the question of the timing of what some people call self-deportation, what I call sexual terrorism, and afraid they were going to be killed. And so if you say, well, the women in Kosovo didn't get pregnant, and so maybe they didn't have to testify, well, that's that's not the nature of it. Some women were killed in Kosovo after what might have been sexual violence, and some women, thank goodness, weren't impregnated, you know. And there's a phenomenon sometimes that happens during war that women's periods stop. It's just it's a physical body shutting down reaction. And so sometimes the percentage of pregnancy isn't what people expect to see and things of that nature.
Nadja?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very important, but also one of those impossible questions to answer. I mean, I personally think that we need lots of different strategies, and although I'm critical of, or I doubt the credibility of the UN and UN resolutions, I also think that we can't just do away with them. I mean, I do think that it is important that there are people, that there are feminists who are actually trying to insist that to challenge the double standard and actually try to get more consistent implementation of UN resolutions across the region. And I think it is important for feminists to pick up other UN resolutions that might not directly link to women's rights, but it is strategically important to link those struggles. I would say that's one tactic. The other one is, I mean, I think what's already happening in the region is that sort of local mobilization of women. And, you know, while I, of course, I'm very critical of this essentialist idea of women as a natural peacemaker, we know, and we heard in the beginning, that women are active agents, women are perpetrators as well, but women in many conflicts do work across ethnic, religious, and political boundaries. You know, as much as they're also, you know, reproducing them. But certainly sort of collective action, mobilization, education is very important. And particularly to put pressure, of course, on the respective politicians, militias, and so on. It's not something that's going to happen from one day to the next. And I don't think it's something that can just happen in the immediate context of a conflict. It's something that we also have to look at in a more holistic manner. But I think that, you know, I don't think there's one solution, but I think that wherever we are based, whether, you know, we're working from within the UN or whether we are based in Syria or we are based in London, there are different channels either in terms of existing institutional mechanisms or local mobilization. But no, I mean, if I would know the answer, then I think we would all be in a better position.
Thank you, Nadja Al-Ali. Thank you, Patricia Sellers, very much.
Thank you very much
for being here with us today. I was wondering when I was going to moderate a talk between a lawyer with an American-Belgian background and an anthropologist with a German-Iraqi background, I was wondering how can I get those two to discuss together and to cross sections, but I think they very beautifully did, as Nadja proposed, and I think we will have more of that in the coming conference. For now, I want to say that Amika is hosting a reception outside, and you're most welcome to join. I wish you a good evening. Bye-bye.